Welcome to the next episode of the Chris Rod Max Show. Today we have Rod with us. Unfortunately, Chris wasn't able to join us today, but we're going to talk about AI stories every single week. We will be getting a lot more news today, especially with the recent rout in the market. What we're going to talk about today is around NVIDIA's dominance in the market, as well as some that has gone in with NVIDIA's recent acquisition on Run.AI. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about Apple. What are they doing with the GPU situation? Who are the players they have chose? Then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Meta's AI strategy, especially with the recent news as well as interview that's happened on Bloomberg was quite interesting. And lastly, because what happened in the market, we all know that the market has been propped up by 7+ AI companies, and now things have come down a little bit. There's a lot of scrutiny around big tech spending spree. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what does that mean? When will the value come with the organization, with all the listeners? So with that, let's start off really quickly. First one, we went through a couple of things. We know NVIDIA has a huge dominance in the GPU market, and there is a recent news where there is some sort of design flaw with the next AI chip, which then have some sort of delay. It's interesting from two reasons. Number one, NVIDIA kind of dominate about 75 to 90% according to the last report of the chip market. So there are a lot of players waiting for this type of GPU. And number two is that NVIDIA also has a lot more competition. Despite some competition not doing as well, e.g. Intel, there are other competitions that are trying to get into the market. Rod, from your perspective, right, what are your take around this AI chip design flow? And how does that actually impact the overall supply of GPU in the market?
Yes, absolutely, Max. So we're talking about the next generation B200, so-called Blackwell AI chip. And it's, as you were saying, that the design flow was discovered very late in the process. And as a result, this chip has been pushed back into the first quarter of next year. And therefore, many of the large buyers from NVIDIA GPUs, such as Microsoft, Google, Meta, and so on, are already placed significant orders. Well, they have to be put into the waiting list. And this is pretty much a successor for the very popular H100 chips. So if anyone who is working with GPUs or doing anything related can attest, this is one of the most sought after chips. And this can be something that can affect innovation, that can be relevant for many companies. Already, if you say, hey, I want to order NVIDIA 800, then you're put into a waiting list. And this waiting list can be up to 2 years. It's not easy at all to get a hold of NVIDIA supply. And not only that, but also it can potentially have an impact in that if this delay takes longer than expected, then so many research lines, so many advancements that are happening on the AI space, they're pretty much the result of optimizations in chip architecture. So people really squeezing the last drop of juice from an AI chip. And if so we cannot have delays models, then many of these researchers who are trying to develop new things, then they might be slowed down or they might be unable to do new lines of work.
Blackwell is the new chip where, it's almost like a follow-up to the H100 chip. We all know that there are tons of interest for the chip. It's really hard to get. Now, the latest one was supposed to supplement that, right? In the sense that it's supposed to replace some of those requirements for those chips. And now with the delay, I guess we'll see, a small little shortage in the market for a very, very short while. And then I must say, though, there are also other players. They are trying to get into this market, right? Famously, for example, AMD, Intel, even Google, right? So if there is a delay in such chip, I don't know if that will switch some players over to other sort of chips. What are your thoughts around that, especially around the competition side?
Some companies might start to think, hey, we might need to pursue a multi-hardware strategy. We might need to look into options. But also the reality is that all the others, they also have their own challenges with the supply chain, with the manufacturing. It's not something where I say, oh, actually, I don't want to buy anymore from NVIDIA because I can get hardware from them. They're completely sold out. And I just go to AMD and say, hey, I want to place the same type of shipment, and then I will get it delivered tomorrow. It's not like that. They also have their own constraints, and they don't have the same level of manufacturing capacity compared to NVIDIA. But more importantly, many of the developments that we have in AI, they're pretty much as a result of over-optimizing for specific hardware architecture. So when you transition to other architectures that are not NVIDIA GPUs, you lose some of that edge. And yes, the AI manufacturers, so it's like AMD, Intel, Google, and so on, they try to compensate it. They try to offer some way to bridge this gap in performance based on so these different type of technologies. But still, you will have that. Then also, well, people need to get used to this new type of architecture, need to understand what are the best use cases, the best niches, so to use the respective ones. It's not exactly, let's say, like plug and play where I say, oh, actually I got bored of NVIDIA and then I want to start adopting this or one and then I just, let's say, like replace one line of code and it happens magically. No, it's not like that. It's really so fine-tuned, it's really tailored the models that we see for the architecture that that were built upon. And this architecture has been historically always NVIDIA GPU.
This is very, very fascinating. I think basically, what you're saying here is because the way that it's designed from an architecture perspective is to have NVIDIA's chip in mind, and therefore it's very optimized for that. If you want to swap out the chip, it requires you to redesign the entire architecture. Hence, the plug and play is not as easy to be achieved as possible. So that's great. That's good to know. So now we know if you want your chip, I guess you just have to wait. So once Nvidia's chip enter the mainstream, the next thing people would think about, optimizing, and hence some of the regulators are also thinking about this. What are the potential problem with antitrust? So on the same vein, I guess we saw the news that I guess DOJ is probing Nvidia for some sort of antitrust issue, especially at the back of the acquisition of Run.AI. Rod, given your technical background, if you could give us a little bit of, I guess, breakdown of what Run.AI does for NVIDIA, it would be good to know. And also, why is, I guess, DOJ looking into this?
Yes, so exactly. We had earlier this year the acquisition of Run.AI by NVIDIA. So Run.AI is an Israeli company. They were acquired for about 700 million. And what they do is so GPU management software. So you have to think that, so if you are a large organization, you do not have just one GPU. Let's say like most of us mortals, they might have, let's say like a laptop, a desktop with maybe one or two GPU cards inside. But a large company, let's say like, we're not even talking like a Google or a Microsoft, but let's think like a large bank. They might have hundreds of GPU cards. And it's a question of how do I make use of them? How do I orchestrate workflows with them? How can I make use of them in the best possible manner and so on? So all these are non-trivial questions. And what Run.AI was offering, they were offering a software that was quite popular among the research community, among pretty much those in the open source space that enabled so this GPU management solution. Given on one side the size of just NVIDIA, so that it's really the number one force in the AI market, both in terms of just the brand, so sales, everything. So like if you think about what is AI, most people will associate as the first company, pretty much NVIDIA. Then regulators are looking at and saying, hey, by enabling this acquisition, are we perhaps consolidating already a huge monopolist? So there is that. But there's also a second problem that is happening in parallel to this, and it's exactly this topic of market pressure. So NVIDIA abusing this market dominance, where it is claimed that NVIDIA might have pressured cloud providers into buying their products and overcharging for networking equipment when networks when the customers choose competitors to AI chips. So here is like this combination of things. So where on one side, hey, by buying Run.AI, maybe NVIDIA is becoming even a much larger monopolist than it is. But then the other one is where we're seeing maybe indications, maybe there are here signs where NVIDIA is pressuring so potential buyers into buying their products, or otherwise there might be repercussions. Because it's estimated that NVIDIA controls up to 95% of the chip market. Yeah, so it's not like so we're now discussing AMD, Intel, and so it's not like we're talking about equal players. No, it's like there's NVIDIA and then there's a long tail of like tiny players.
I think thinking about Run AI, about how it could potentially run, I think, like you said, right, there is the possibility that this Run AI kind of sits on top of all the different chips, and then they will just keep driving resources over to NVIDIA's chip. And if that's the case, eventually you kind of just have like NVIDIA trying to, I guess, run everything off the chip. You almost need to engage the software folks to sell more chips, and the way to do that is direct more more of the computing resources towards your own chip so that people will need more of those chips. That's at least how I think about it. So the potential monopolistic play here will be quite profound.
And we have this through history, even today. So if you look at that, for example, you can see AMD and Intel in the chip market. We see that AMD keeps bringing better products than Intel, especially in recent years. The AMD chipsets are cheaper. They're also faster. They also tend to heat up less and so on. So they are overall a much better product. But then you ask yourself, hey, why I don't see any laptops with AMD chips? Why is everything Intel, even though everyone complains that at the moment they are really struggling with their quality and their products? And it's pretty much that is that they have this market dominance, and then they use that to enforce that manufacturers, they buy from them, especially for the flagship products, and say, hey, if you're launching a flagship laptop, it cannot come with AMD chips. It must come here with Intel ones. And something like that can start happening with NVIDIA. And of course, now it's everything fine because they are the leaders. But let's say what happens if potentially all these other more niche players start bringing much better products. Then we might have a situation where we don't have innovation, not because there are no good products in the market, but just because those who are buying those products are contractually obliged to buy from a single source and not look into the market and see who is the best in the market.
Hence, there's a need to allow for more competition and any sort of practices that can monopolize the entire, let's say, computation market or whatever market. It's probably bad. Great. I guess on the same vein, on chip, we spoke about AMD, we spoke about Intel, and there's also a news where Apple has opted for Google chips in its infrastructure. In a way, I think is to counter what is going on with NVIDIA, e.g. its dominance, e.g. some of the delay. I find it quite fascinating. Two giant big tech companies coming together and basically it's almost like an infighting between the Magnificent Seven. I actually spent some time reading about TPU because Google published this, history of Google TPUs, how it came about, how they designed it. It was quite fascinating. But I guess I would like to get your thoughts, Rod. What do you think of the news with Apple using Google chips, at least for some of the things that they're trying to do at the moment?
Yes, what happened is that a research publication with Apple researchers, it was revealed that Apple has been using, at least partially, maybe not necessarily for everything, but for the research efforts, they have been using Google TPUs. And TPUs is a tensor processing unit. It's basically like an alternative architecture to the NVIDIA GPUs. And traditionally, any type of researcher, any type of academic who is doing cutting edge research, they will, so by default, work with NVIDIA GPUs, NVIDIA hardware. They will not be looking to something else. So it was quite a surprise to see that Apple is actually exploring and is actually doing research on so this type of architecture. We sort of like hint that for their services, not for their devices, the consumer devices that we will have, they pack their own chipsets, but for their cloud services, so they're now coming up with writing assistants and image editors and so on. So pretty much sparkling AI into their core products. So the assumption is that these services, they might be powered by Google TPUs and not by NVIDIA GPUs. And it goes back to like what we're just discussing now, in that on one side, we have a situation with a problem with supply. There are significant constraints. Then discussion of, okay, this is potentially monopolies who has a great control of the market, and Apple has a long history with dealing with monopolies across history, so through Microsoft, Intel, etc. On this topic, of course, saying that the problem is that these architectures or the research that is built on for these architectures is very optimized for architecture themselves. So if Apple starts doing a lot of things on a TPU type of architecture, others might follow, and then this edge that is happening right now with NVIDIA GPUs in terms of how it's developed and in terms of the ecosystem might start to erode. Of course, it's a little bit maybe like long term, but this can be just the beginning. However, there's like a caveat where we must remember that in the past also Apple bet into providers, into suppliers who maybe might have had superior technical solutions, but in the end could not deliver, could not so provide the necessary supply of the product. And concretely, for example, so back in the late 90s, there was this PowerPC architecture. So we have to remember that before Apple had their own chipsets, they were using Intel chips. And before that, they had chips provided by a consortium made of IBM and Motorola. And what happened was that on paper, this architecture had some benefits over Intel architecture back then, But the main problem was that they could not keep up with innovation and manufacturing. So always Intel, especially in this period, kept kept bringing to the market products that were cheaper, faster, and better, pretty much on a yearly cadence. Whereas the suppliers that Apple was relying on, they were a little bit of left behind, and that has forced Apple to adopt Intel chipsets. And later, that also what forced Apple to switch to their own because Intel started to lag behind. They were not able to provide good chips for laptop devices that will not heat up, that will be fast, and so on. So here, the, let's say, positive side, maybe the optimistic take is that amazing diversification, new architectures, new things, this can be really good for the industry. But potentially a pessimistic one will be that, okay, we have already seen this playbook so in the past, and it can be that in the end, so Apple goes back to just using NVIDIA GPUs because maybe so Google TPUs are too niche in order to provide a mass scale.
Mhm. That's thank you so much for the breakdown, Rod. That's super helpful. I think what I have in my mind is basically, Apple will always optimize it for whatever it is they need to do. And if you're not serving its needs, especially when they learn from their past experience, around the CPU stuff, I think it will actually, you know, I guess provide an innings for technological breakthrough that actually work, or it will serve the other way, right? Basically, just go down the route of taking on any players that will help them to achieve their goal.
What do you, Matt? So what do you advise to companies? So do you say, hey, so here bet on, so here the winning horse so far in the race, even though this might be a monopolist, even though that might pretty much so force you into some terms that might not be beneficial to you, or so go into like the unproven player who might have more attractive terms, but you know long term what happened to it.
I think it really depends on the business itself. So the reason why I said that is it depends on how important, I guess, producer it is to the product. So what do I mean by that? So number one, if you're a hardware product, let's say someone like Apple, your whole premise of selling a business was the hardware. So then having a very strong hardware is performance based is super important. And then, whereas if you're just, I guess, using some sort of processing unit at the back, and your product is really very much around at the front end on the workflow side, it doesn't have to go split second speed, but it helps to do the job. Then you would bet on some players that give you the better economics, right? You may not necessarily go for the top GPU. It's a little bit like if you're a top end gamer, you would use top end GPUs in order to play the top end games. But if you're not playing top end games, you don't necessarily need the top GPU. You could perform probably equally well on some of the mid range GPU. It really depends on the game. So I guess that's at least how I think about it. It has to be fit for purpose. Not everyone needs the top end GPU. I think when we realize that LLM could do a lot more, it could be optimized a lot more, maybe there isn't a need for such, I guess, high performing chip asset. But at least that's the current thinking that I have. But who knows? Some of these models are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Perhaps bigger is better. Then, on that note, we're going to shift gears and move to another big tech, which is Meta. Meta has signals, some sort of long-term AI strategy, with Mark Zuckerberg kind of just outlined Meta's vision going forward. And also, there's a huge, I would say, drive to have some sort of compute cluster around data, around, I guess, data centers from Meta, as well as its rivals within the Magnificent Seven ground. Not to mention, they also come up with some sort of model, a llama themselves. So I guess, Rod, love to get your thoughts around, I guess, Meta's AI strategy so far. Maybe just a quick breakdown on, what is it that they're trying to do, and also give us a little bit about your thoughts around, how is Meta positioned compared to other players in the AI space.
Yes, so here a lot is happening. So on one side is the topic of the current open source landscape is being powered, maybe not primarily, but one of the driving forces is pretty much Meta. So where their Llama models are free of charge, anyone can just go and download it, start building with them. The models are really among the best in the market. They always give the OpenAI models a run for their money. And as a result, they are a little bit of so enabling that other players can compete on the same level of OpenAI, which, for example, for OpenAI, this is a problem because at some point, especially last year, we're thinking OpenAI might become a monopolist. It might become the next number one destination for everything. So where you think, where do I go to spend all my day on the internet? Well, it will be likely on ChatGPT because on ChatGPT you will be able to do everything. You'll be able to use it for your homework. You'll be able to book, I don't know, like a flight, plan a trip. Maybe it will help you to work on your business and so on. So you will be all day immersed into the OpenAI ecosystem. In the show, we had discussions about this idea of having a marketplace and a store for ChatGPT. And then also this idea of how search is changing, and that now instead of, for example, going to Google, we'll go to Perplexity or to ChatGPT. And this means that the eyeballs that are on the OpenAI platforms spend a lot of time there, which of course is very, very negative for companies such as Meta, because this means that instead of you being on Instagram or being on Facebook, then you're spending your day in OpenAI. And because these products, so Instagram, Facebook, also WhatsApp, they monetize through advertisement. So this assumes that people are spending their day on the Meta platforms and not somewhere else. But by offering these open source models, then pretty much what Meta is doing is not necessarily generating more revenue for themselves, not necessarily increasing the number of eyeballs in their platform, but a little bit of leveling up the playing field. This way, they give great tools to others, and as a result, the edge that OpenAI has becomes smaller, and we have then the status quo where people keep spending their time still on Instagram, still on other platforms, and then also, of course, OpenAI, but not as it could have been. And also at the same time, so the other thing is that they can have these tools that are open source, and they can adopt across company. All Meta products these days have some sort of like AI functionality, and therefore drive innovation. So putting this into like a perspective historically, Meta has always struggled in that it has never been a rule maker, but a rule taker. It has always been living on someone else's platforms. And what Meta is trying to achieve is some sort of independence, trying to find how they monetize which product they bring and so on. And at the moment they cannot, because they're dependent on the Apple Store, on the Google Store, and so on. There's always an app. That's why we have in the past years a big push towards the metaverse. That's why a few years back we had also this effort into trying to bring like a Facebook phone or like Facebook operating system. That really didn't work. But historically, the company has been looking at how can we become a platform and not just an app inside someone else's platform. And one way how this could happen is also through AI tools.
It's almost like, Facebook Meta has always been an application in an OS rather than an OS themselves. So they're trying to be the OS. It's almost like, Google come up with Chrome, almost, right? They do not want to live on someone else's platform. And then them buying Android, is probably the same idea. I guess the question for Meta around AI is, what kind of OS can they run on? So AI is one of them, right? Because everyone will now try to interact with their devices via, some sort of AI. So being the OS for the AI, hence why open sourcing Llama kind of makes sense from their strategy, which I find it fascinating. So they're trying to battle the iOS versus Android on the mobile devices, or compete with like all the different, I would call it, I guess, OS on computers, e.g. Chrome, e.g. Microsoft, e.g. Linux, etc.
So how do you see from an investor perspective where, Mark Zuckerberg is reporting that the next Llama model, they are expecting it will require nearly 10 times more computing power than its predecessor. And already Meta is telling to investors that they are spending on all these AI initiatives around $40 billion this year. How do you look at that? So thinking, for example, like in companies, where in this case, we have a situation where it is a company spending significant amount of capital and resources in initiatives that are strategic, but they are not having a direct impact in revenue or profit and so on. And how will you look at that? So the company says, we want to, for example, invest in these tools for the ecosystem, and it will cost a lot of money, but it will likely not generate any money for us.
So I would say if you're a venture investor, which, very much in line with what the Silicon Valley mindset, you are supposed to invest into something that has some sort of, I guess, high upfront costs, but eventually when you run it, has some sort of low marginal cost. no cost will increase with it. Hence, with all this large investment into AI, the bet is something interesting will come out of it at the back of it. My general sense is, I think we're already seeing some of the possibility with the AI, but we haven't quite seen prime time with a lot of the AI applications. So one will question, at what point will that flip? What are the underlying signals that's saying that some of this can actually start generating revenue down the line? From an, I guess, investor standpoint, it really depends on the use cases, or what kind of value are they driving from the end user perspective. I think that would be what I care more about, right? Because the more people use it, the more opportunity you can figure out how to monetize it. I mean, this is something that I guess happened in the internet space, right? I believe Amazon, when Bezos wanted to start Amazon, he saw there's nothing growing as quickly as the internet back then. Hence, he said that the more people use it, even though you can't monetize it yet, chances are you will try to figure out what are the monetization strategy down the line. I think from an AI perspective as well, it's about how many people will continue using some of those AI applications that will utilize some of these investments that the large tech are trying to be the pick and shovels for.
When you see that the focus of where you're saying, hey, so Meta in this case is a platform to connect people, enable them to communicate and so on, and now they're investing massive amounts of resources in developing AI open source tools.
The AI tools are not just helpful for them, right? As we talked about earlier, if Meta's overall goal is to connect people, and they will eventually have to have some sort of OS themselves, which is what they're trying to do, right? Try to compete with the Microsoft, the Chrome, the iOS, the Androids of the world. So they don't have such thing. So they probably see this as a little edge that they can push in. I guess the metaverse conversation around this as well. The whole idea of Mark Zuckerberg pushing for metaverse is that they see it as a new way for us as consumer to interact with the internet. That kind of just gives them a way to create like a new OS almost, right? New operating system, in new ways to improve the interaction with devices. And with that happening, AI kind of just enabled that. So if we take that lens from a Facebook's perspective, it feels like they are trying to do something. It might look disparate, but somehow aligned to what they're trying to achieve. At least that's how I think about it. But how about you, Rod? What do you think from that perspective?
Well, of course, our ecosystem is amazing that we have more players that are trading on open source tools and so on. I do think that so the challenge will be now that if indeed these claims are true, that the next models will require 10 times more resources and so on, is really we're seeing how, let's say, so to say, these low-hanging fruits are starting to disappear. And so it becomes something where not only is harder and harder the topic of collecting data, we have already spoke about that many times on the show, but also the topic of compute, where do I get like the GPUs, and also talent to dedicate work for this. And what happens is also in terms of innovation, that who has then the resources to come up with new things? Well, it becomes pretty much these very selected companies. So although we might think maybe this is a bit of a distraction, so from an investor side of saying, hey, this is not contributing to revenue, this is not really necessarily something that is part of like the core mission of the company. I think that this might long-term also cement their position as maybe not as monopolies, but really as so leaders in technology space. We think also, for example, about so war for talent. Given that this type of research requires so many resources, then top researchers, top talent, they will flock into any company that is in this space, and there will not be many. It will be pretty much, let's say, like Meta, Microsoft, Google, and so on. So this really, in the end, also like entrenches the incumbents, because if you're, for example, a large bank, or you're, for example, a large, so let's take a telecommunications provider, that you also say, hey, I want to do AI, you will not be able to compete with this type of organizations. You will not be able to say, hey, I take like here 40 billion and I will just like put it into some AI research in order to be able to attract the top talent, or to be able to get the best results and so on. So potentially, so the short-term look will be saying completely focus is a extraction of resources and not good, but mid-term to long-term, I would say that this entrenches the existing players in the space.
I think over time, especially for new technology, it's almost better to overspend than underspend. The need to optimize sometimes can be, I would say, dangerous for the mid and long term, especially for such large company. I guess with that, just to switch gear a little bit, obviously we talk about all the different big techs, and there is a recent article on FT which says that big tech groups are upping their 100 billion AI spending spree are just the beginning. So, I guess in the same vein to what we're talking about, Rod, here, is that, they're all betting on the medium and long term. But at the same time, they're activist investors, people like Elliot, saying that, the AI is overhyped and NVIDIA is in a bubble. I kind of find that quite interesting because you have, I guess, the business folks, they're thinking about it slightly differently. And then you have the investor community who look at it differently. So I mean, from my perspective, I can see where Elliot's coming from. Obviously, they predominantly care about how to turn a business around very quickly. Let's say, I don't know, 12 to 18 months. Whereas people like Meta betting on AI is really thinking about the 3-5 years down the road. How will the world change in the next 10 years, for example? So I guess, Rod, from your perspective, maybe you can break down a little bit, how much our large big tech folks have been spending in the first 6 months of 2024, as well as, understanding a little bit around, what are some of the gain and losses that they've done so far on that 106 billion.
Yes, so we're talking about these large tech companies that we all know, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and it is estimated that just in the first half of this year, they have spent over 100 billion US dollars in AI-related investments. This is 50% more than what they were spending last year. And yet, so far, none of them really has the revenue numbers to justify this type of expenditure. So right now we're in a situation of trust us, we're doing the right thing. And so right now is the time to overinvest in this space, because then later we'll have this dominating position in the market. We'll be really here the go-to place for this, and all other companies will build on top of us. So it makes sense to now build this and then everyone come. Yeah, so build it and then come. But yes, it's a question of if there is not, so here overexpenditure is happening. So we also have this parallels with the internet. If we think about the early 2000s, there was also a period, for example, where it was all about optic fiber and so on. And so that there was so much infrastructure was built with the expectation that people are coming to the internet, they will spend their whole lives there and so on. So we need to be ready for them. We need to already enable applications for like video, live video, voice over IP, like very data intensive applications. And we're talking about so now more than 20 years, but we know what happened, that this infrastructure was set in place. And yes, at some point, for example, now we're having all this where we have live video conferences over internet. We also have phone calls over internet and so on. But it took many, many years. So immediately after this infrastructure was put in place, not much was happening. So you think about how people were surfing so the internet back in, let's say, 2002, 2003, maybe like until like before 2010, it was pretty much of saying, hey, I go online, I check some emails, maybe like I browse a little bit and so on, but my time online will be maybe like half an hour, 45 minutes per day. And this will be pretty much limited to static text reading, so writing and so on. It will not be like any type of data intensive applications. So this could happen. So now it could happen that, yes, indeed, these companies are doing massive investments, but we will not see any type of relevant numbers in terms of like returns on all this expenditure in many, many years. So it can happen in a similar manner that in the end, people indeed, they adopt AI tools. They're starting to adopt it, but it happens much lower than we expect.
I think that's I guess resonate with some of the things that I have in my mind, right? So number one is that a lot of all this expenditure is actually going to like land and new data centers for cloud computing businesses. We may not see that immediately, the immediate value today, but that doesn't mean that it won't come. And also building new applications and new ways of doing things always take a little bit longer than we like, especially if it's so transformational. So to your point, Rod, it's around, I guess, let's say the internet. We spent a lot of money building all the different infrastructure back then. And eventually, the internet was quick enough and fast enough. People started adopting and using it more. for different type of application. I guess one thing that I constantly think about is, number one, let's say when I was doing in university, internet was, really getting adopted a lot more, like mobile, for example. What happened is, if you go to school, people say that, don't copy from Wikipedia if you were to do your assignment. But if you think about now, your university will say that, don't use AI to write your assignment for you. It's like that's kind of like the sign that I'm seeing, like, this can be adopted. And more often than not, the younger generation kind of just picked it up as fast as possible. Whatever it is that can help them to get that A or B or C or passes in their exam. So I do think in the long run, some of this expenditure, I guess I'm a little bit pro, will eventually see the returns, because it's potentially transformational. But if you think about the downside of it, even if we don't see anything, would you rather see them taking that money and do nothing about it? Or would you rather see them invest into something that has some opportunity to change the way we work? I would say the same about Metaverse. Yeah, people, I guess, shit on Facebook, saying that they spend a lot of money on Metaverse. Yes, from an investor perspective, but from a social perspective, I would rather they take the experiment and make something good with it, with the money, than not doing anything.
I would say here is a little bit of like a clash between the optimist and, I don't know, say realist, but let's say like the less optimist in the market. So what you were saying, this Elliot letter that was sent around saying that so we are a little bit in an AI bubble, and it is about to pop pretty much, so that the AI is overhyped. This connects to a topic that we discussed in previous weeks of also Goldman Sachs having this extensive report saying all this AI expenditure will not deliver the returns that these companies are expecting. There is no way that so much revenue will be generated to compensate all these massive levels of investment and expenditure. At the same time, well, the companies are saying, no, actually, we are approaching the next wave, let alone technology, so pretty much of humanity, how society interacts as a whole and so on. And people that do that will be AI. And as a result, those who control the AI pretty much will be like the masters of the universe. So on one side, the financiers are saying, so hold your horses. So here, let us look at the numbers, and maybe you are like being a bit extremely optimistic, bullish, and excessive with your level of expenditure. And maybe instead of just pretty much so throwing money into a bonfire, why not you do, I don't know, stock buybacks or pay a dividend or something? So give us money to us, and if likely this might not work as it is. Whereas the companies are saying, you are wrong. So now it's like the time in history. This is also like the time where new players can appear. So let's just think about OpenAI. 5 years ago, or even just 3 years ago, who had OpenAI in the radars? Or even those who were aware of OpenAI, who would have thought, hey, OpenAI is really now on the same level. You would put it on the same sentence as a Google, as an Apple, as a Microsoft. Really like nobody. And this shows that when there are these disruptive technologies, new players can appear. So also the incumbents say, hey, if we also do not here try to play a major role, then we can be disrupted, and then like a perplexity AI can come, destroy Google's search engine business model, and become like the new number one destination for searches on the internet.
I totally agree. I think with new disruption, it's always better to overspend than underspend. I think this is what Mark Zuckerberg say, not me. So I totally agree. Great. I think with that, thank you so much for listening in. Today, what we have talked about is basically a quick news on NVIDIA around their design floor chip, as well as the DOJ's probe into the acquisition of Run.AI. We then spent a little bit of time talking about Apple opting for Google chips infrastructure as compared to just NVIDIA. We also spent a little bit of time thinking about Meta's AI strategy, about how it's all about future profits instead of immediate profits. And then we talk a little bit about how your big tech groups are spending billions and billions on AI, and that is just the beginning. Some people are happy about it, maybe like me. Some people are not, people like Elliot. So we'll see what will play out in the next and in the future. And with that, just remember to like, subscribe for the best place to get latest news on AI. Thank you very much for listening in. We will speak to you next week.